When black belt fighter Ryder Kane pointed at Nolan Vance on the charity gala stage and smiled, "Try not to cry, Dad," the crowd laughed. Nolan was just a quiet farmer in a worn work shirt still carrying Tennessee soil, a man who had driven an old pickup to this glittering event for one reason: to save his land from foreclosure. Nobody understood why he accepted the challenge and stepped between the ropes, and nobody understood why a retired rear admiral rose from his seat the moment he saw the tattoo on Nolan's wrist. Ryder threw the first punch. Nolan had not raised a single fist. If you believe the quietest people carry the heaviest stories, stay with Nolan until the very last moment. 6 days before the gala, Willow Bend Farm woke up the way it always did. In the dark, before the sun had any opinion about the matter. Nolan Vance was already outside by 4 in the morning, crouching beside the irrigation pump at the edge of the lower pasture, using a headlamp and a wrench he had owned since he was 22 years old. The pump had been failing for 3 weeks, and a repair crew would have cost more than he could justify. So he fixed it himself the same way he fixed most things on the property, slowly, carefully, without complaint. By the time the sky shifted from black to a pale gray, he had moved on to the cattle barn, checked water levels in every trough, confirmed the feed rotation for the week, and walked the perimeter of the 2 bunkhouses where 6 veterans currently lived and worked. He paused at the door of the second bunkhouse, long enough to hear that everyone inside was still sleeping, and decided not to knock, because none of them needed to be reminded that the farm started early. They already knew, and they never missed a morning. Willow Bend was not a wealthy operation, and anyone who spent an hour on its land could see that, but Nolan ran it with a precision that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with habit. The letter arrived with the afternoon mail, tucked between an equipment catalog and a notice about county water rates, and Nolan read it standing at the kitchen counter without sitting down. Red Harbor Logistics had purchased the outstanding balance on Willow Bend's agricultural loan from the original bank, and Nolan had $186,000 due within 7 days, or the property would proceed to auction. He set the letter flat on the counter and read it a second time, not because he had misunderstood the first reading, but because he was looking for the specific clause that justified the accelerated timeline. Willow Bend had never missed a payment, never violated a major covenant, and the loan was not due for renegotiation for another 14 months. There was no clause because the terms had simply been written to allow a new holder to demand full payment on acquisition, buried in a paragraph on page 11 of an agreement he had signed years ago, when the bank was the kind of institution that did not typically sell farm loans to logistics companies. Jonah Reed, who had been with Nolan for 3 years after coming off a difficult post-service period, came in from the equipment shed and read the letter over his shoulder, and the 2 men stood in silence for a long moment before Jonah suggested they post about the situation to bring in community support. Nolan shook his head without much discussion on the matter, because he had made a decision long ago that the people working at Willow Bend would never be used as props in a campaign for sympathy, and he was not going to reverse that decision because he was the one in financial trouble. Avery called from her university dormitory that evening, and Nolan told her things were fine, but she had been reading his silences since she was old enough to know that he had them, and she asked twice whether something was wrong before he finally said he was just tired from the pump repair. She let it go, but she did not believe him. The gala invitation arrived the following morning in a thick envelope bearing the seal of the Carrington Foundation. The letter described a charitable event in Nashville organized to raise funds for veteran support programs, and it mentioned that Willow Bend had been identified as a candidate for a long-term agricultural development grant. Nolan read the invitation twice as well, though for different reasons, because attached to it was a separate flyer describing an exhibition match in which mixed martial arts champion Ryder Kane would award $250,000 to any local civilian who could remain standing against him for 3 full minutes. Nolan set both documents on the kitchen table side by side. He looked at them for a long time without moving. Then he picked up a pen and circled the name Red Harbor Logistics on the bank letter, and circled it again on the list of corporate sponsors printed on the back of the gala invitation, and the circle he drew the second time was harder into the paper. The drive from Willow Bend to the Nashville Convention Center took just under 2 hours, and Nolan made it in his work truck without stopping to change out of the clothes he had been wearing since morning. The parking area adjacent to the main entrance was lined with European sedans and leased SUVs, and his truck sat among them the way a barn cat sits at a formal dinner. Present, unbothered, and not particularly interested in adjusting to the room's expectations. He had not come to fight. His original intention for the evening was to find someone from the Carrington Foundation's grant committee and present the Willow Bend operational records, which he had organized into a manila folder tucked under his arm. The convention center's main hall had been transformed into something between a charity auction and a sporting event, with round tables arranged near a raised exhibition ring and LED lighting that made everything look either expensive or dangerous, depending on where you were standing. Celeste Carrington moved through the space with the particular efficiency of someone who had attended 400 events exactly like this one, and had learned to extract the necessary information from each of them in the first 12 minutes. She was surrounded by attorneys, donors, and 2 individuals who appeared to have no function other than to look busy near her, and she navigated the crowd without pausing long enough to give anyone a conversation they had not already earned. Grant Holloway stood near the ring with a practiced smile and introduced Ryder Kane to a cluster of donors as a symbol of discipline, drive, and the kind of character that corporate America was proud to support. Ryder was broad-shouldered and photogenic, with the easy confidence of someone who had been told he was exceptional often enough that he had stopped noticing the people who disagreed. He ran through a series of demonstration techniques with a rotating group of volunteers, and he was technically impressive, fast, controlled, precise. But there was a quality to the way he handled each volunteer that was slightly off. A fraction too much force here, a half-second too long, holding a submission there, just enough to remind everyone watching that he could have done more damage if he had chosen to. When he brought a former Marine in his late 50s to the mat with more power than the situation required, and then grinned at the nearest camera, Nolan moved through the crowd and helped the man to his feet. He did not say anything to Ryder. He handed the Marine a cup of water, checked his shoulder briefly, and stepped back. Ryder noticed Nolan's worn work boots, the calluses across his knuckles, the way his shirt did not quite fit the way dress shirts were supposed to fit on someone who used his body as a tool every day, and he pointed at him the way people point at things they intend to take apart. Grant had already identified Nolan from the Foundation's applicant files and recognized him as the owner of Willow Bend. He leaned close to Ryder and said something brief near his ear, and Ryder's smile shifted into something sharper. When Nolan reached the Foundation's intake table and asked to speak with someone about a discrepancy between the Gala's sponsorship list and the company that had purchased his loan, Celeste Carrington was the one who happened to be standing there, and she looked at him the way she looked at anything that had arrived without being scheduled. He did not ask for money. He did not describe his situation as an emergency or appeal to her sense of fairness. He simply laid the 2 documents on the table, the bank notice and the Gala sponsor list, and asked whether the Foundation was aware that one of its corporate partners was actively acquiring distressed veteran farm loans at an accelerated rate. Celeste picked up both documents and read them without responding, and Grant stepped in to explain that Nolan was a business owner looking for someone to blame for his own poor financial planning. Ryder, who had followed from across the room, suggested loudly that the foundation should put their money behind people who actually built things rather than people who let things fall apart. The crowd that had gathered for the exchange shifted slightly, the way crowds shift when they sense that something is about to go one of two very different ways. The exhibition match offer was made publicly, with the purse elevated to $250,000, and every person in that hall expected Nolan to decline. Nolan asked whether the funds would be placed in an independent escrow account before the match began. The question took Grant 3 full seconds to answer. The contract the Gala's legal team produced was 11 pages long and written in the kind of language that is specifically designed to be understood only by people who already know what it says. Nolan stood at a side table with the document and read it without the help of an attorney, moving through each page at a pace that suggested he had read contracts before in contexts where the consequences of misreading them were considerably more serious than losing a cash prize. He reached the appendix on page 9 and tapped a specific clause with his index finger, a provision allowing Ryder to apply a broader range of techniques if the opposing participant gave written consent, which the contract framed as a standard safety enhancement. He found a second clause on page 10 that allowed the event organizers to void the prize if the participant had any professional competitive record in combat sports. Nolan did not dispute either clause directly. He requested that the definition of professional competitive record be specified in writing, and he stated clearly, in front of the lawyers and the cameras that had by then positioned themselves around the table, that military service, law enforcement experience, and emergency response work were not to be classified as professional combat sports careers. The precision with which he read and annotated the document made Celeste set down her glass and watch him more carefully. Nolan also required the escrow deposit to be confirmed by a third-party financial institution before he stepped anywhere near the ring, and Grant agreed because the cameras were still rolling, and declining would have meant explaining why. While the legal team finalized revisions, Nolan looked at the list of event management companies printed on the back of the contract, and he found an address that appeared on both that document and on the letterhead of the correspondence from Red Harbor Logistics. It was a suite number in a commercial office park outside Knoxville, the kind of address that exists primarily to give a company a mailing location without requiring anyone to actually work there. He folded this information into a small note and passed it to Celeste without explanation, without asking her to believe him, without requesting anything in return. She looked at the note for a moment, then placed it in the interior pocket of her jacket and said nothing. Later that evening, she called her private auditing firm and asked them to begin a quiet review of all transactions between Carrington Foundation accounts and entities connected to Red Harbor, instructing them specifically not to notify anyone in Grant's operational division. When Ryder shoulder-checked Nolan during the promotional photo session, a move that would have staggered most men of similar size, Nolan absorbed it without shifting his weight noticeably, and Ryder's expression flickered for just a moment with something that was not quite confidence. A reporter nearby asked Nolan if he had any fighting experience. He said he had spent most of his life learning to avoid fights that did not need to happen. The reporter printed the quote as evidence of fear. That night, Avery called again. This time Nolan told her the farm was in danger. He still did not tell her everything, not the full scope of the loan transfer, not the nature of the company behind it, not what he suspected Grant Holloway was building, but he told her enough that the conversation between them was honest rather than managed. She said that hiding the truth from someone to protect them and actually protecting them were not always the same thing. And she said it gently, The way people say things that they have been waiting a long time to say. Nolan sat with the phone on the kitchen table after she hung up and looked at a metal box on the top shelf of the pantry. A box that contained his lieutenant commander insignia, his unit citation, a photograph of 8 men standing in a configuration that most people would not recognize as the posture of people who have just survived something. He did not open it. He put the phone in his pocket and went outside to check the pump one more time. The days before the gala passed the way the days on Willow Bend always passed, with physical work that required attention and offered nothing in the way of distraction from the weight of what was coming. Nolan did not train the way people might have expected a man preparing for an exhibition match to train. He did not hire a sparring partner, or set up a bag in the barn, or spend hours reviewing footage of Ryder Kane. He carried feed sacks across the north field and paid attention to his breathing. He walked the perimeter of the property on wet ground and noted where his balance shifted. He repaired a section of the south fence and watched the way his cattle moved around obstacles, because animals that spent their lives outdoors knew things about balance and efficiency that most people forgot the moment they stepped into a gym. Jonah watched him work one morning and recognized something in the way Nolan moved that had nothing to do with farming. A quality in his footwork, a specific economy of motion in the way he turned his body when carrying weight, the kind of physical composure that is not taught at a gym, but at a place where getting it wrong has consequences that cannot be undone. Jonah asked him directly, standing at the water trough with 2 empty buckets in his hands. Nolan said only that the past did not help pay what they owed. What Nolan had never told anyone at Willow Bend, and what he had specifically asked the Military Records Office to keep at the minimum disclosure level, was that he had served as a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, commanding a SEAL team through 3 operational deployments. The last of those deployments involved the extraction of 17 civilians from a location that had been compromised in ways that required improvisation at a scale that training could approximate but never fully prepare a person for. He had brought everyone out. He had lost one man, his closest friend in the unit, a point of grief he carried not loudly but continuously, the way a structural beam carries weight, invisibly, completely, without needing anyone to acknowledge the effort. His wife died of an illness during the period of his final debriefings, and he left the Navy without accepting the promotion that had been offered, and he went home to raise Avery in a place where the work was honest, and the expectations were clear, and nobody needed him to be the person he had been when he was 29 years old. He did not hide his past because it shamed him. He hid it because he had decided that his daughter deserved a father who was fully present in her actual life, not a man whose identity was built around events she would never be able to share, events that had cost too many people too much to be repurposed into a personal brand. Celeste arrived at Willow Bend 2 days before the gala, unannounced, driving herself in a car that was nice but not ostentatious, wearing clothes that were clearly expensive but not clearly intended to signal that fact. She told Nolan she was doing a site verification for the Foundation's applicant files. He walked her through the property without any attempt to make it look better than it was. And she saw veterans who were working real jobs and receiving real wages and living in bunkhouses that were clean and functional, and treated as homes rather than as set dressing for a charitable narrative. In the records room, Nolan spread out every piece of correspondence he had received from Red Harbor Logistics, along with the original loan documents, the timeline of the acquisition, and a map of the properties in the county that had received similar letters in the previous 8 months. Celeste laid her auditor's preliminary findings beside his documents, and together they traced a corridor of land that ran across 3 counties, a route that would give a controlling entity the ability to move goods across Middle Tennessee without passing through any infrastructure governed by existing regulatory agreements. Willow Bend was the last remaining gap in that corridor. Celeste's auditor had found Grant Holloway's internal approval signature on 4 of the loan transfer authorizations. She told Nolan she could handle this through internal channels and that he should withdraw from the match to avoid unnecessary risk. He thanked her for the offer and declined, because he had already calculated that a quiet internal resolution would give Grant enough time to delete documents and restructure the shell companies before any investigation could reach him. The only way to keep everything visible was to keep Grant watching the ring while the evidence surfaced publicly. He told her he had been in contact with an investigative reporter named Mara Quinn, and that Mara had agreed to hold the documents until the match began and then release them simultaneously to multiple outlets. Celeste understood what he was doing. She sat with that for a moment before she understood that she trusted him, which was a conclusion she did not arrive at easily and had not expected to arrive at from this direction. Grant moved the auction date for Willow Bend from the afternoon following the gala to the morning of the same day, a change that closed Nolan's last window for a legal delay and made the match the only remaining lever available to him. On the morning of the gala, Grant released a statement to a friendly media outlet suggesting that Nolan Vance had fabricated or embellished his military service history to obtain charitable funding. Because most of Nolan's service record involved classified operations, the public portion of his file was thin: rank, dates of service, a few commendations listed without context, and Grant's team used that thinness as the negative space they needed. The story circulated through the event's media coverage by afternoon, and 3 of the Foundation's larger institutional donors contacted Celeste's office to demand that Willow Bend's application be suspended pending verification. The town that surrounded the farm was not a place where people fell easily into one opinion, and by the time Nolan arrived at the convention center for the evening session, he had already received 17 text messages, 9 from people who believed him, 5 from people who did not, and 3 from people who believed him but were worried about what believing him would cost them. Ryder held a public weigh-in that served no technical purpose for an exhibition match, but provided several minutes of camera time, and during it he produced a box of tissues from a table near the ring and held it out toward Nolan with a smile that had been practiced in the mirror enough times to look spontaneous. "Try not to cry, Dad," Ryder said, and then he added, "Your daughter might be watching." Nolan looked at the box of tissues. He set it on the table. He checked the wrist wrapping on his left hand, asked the independent referee a specific question about the no-strike zones, and wrote the answer down in a small notebook he kept in his back pocket. Ryder had expected anger or embarrassment, and the absence of either left him with a feeling he was not accustomed to and did not immediately recognize as the early stages of concern. Grant appeared at Nolan's shoulder 30 minutes before the match began and offered him $50,000 to withdraw due to a fabricated shoulder injury. Nolan listened to the offer without expression, confirmed the amount twice by asking Grant to repeat himself, and said he would think about it. He had already pressed the record function on the phone in his chest pocket when Grant walked over. Celeste was told by 2 board members that the match needed to be canceled to protect the Foundation's reputation. She told them that canceling the live broadcast would hand editorial control of the entire evening's narrative to the people who had the most to gain from reshaping it, and that she was not going to do that. Rear Admiral Everett Shaw arrived with 2 other former naval officers, checked in with the event staff, and took his seat at the honorary table near the stage without drawing attention. He had seen Nolan's name on the participant list and was not fully certain it was the same man, because the name Vance was not uncommon and the description, farmer, single father, Tennessee, did not obviously connect to the officer he remembered. Grant changed the technical parameters of the match at the last minute to allow Ryder a wider range of contact techniques, citing audience interest. Nolan agreed to the change only after a second independent referee was added, and after the new parameters were documented in writing with both referees' signatures. In the dressing room, Jonah asked Nolan if he genuinely believed he could get through this. Nolan said that getting through it was not the point. The point was to keep Grant convinced that everything was going according to his plan for long enough to make sure nothing actually was. He sent a single message to Mara Quinn before walking out. Nolan entered the ring without music, without a team, without a robe or an entrance routine. The crowd's response was laughter broken by a few scattered patches of uncertain silence. The kind of silence that happens when people are not sure whether they are witnessing comedy or something else. Ryder entered to a curated soundtrack and the specific choreography of a person who has performed his own entrance many times and refined it to a precise science. He looked at Nolan the way a craftsman looks at a problem he has already solved. The bell rang. Ryder opened with a combination sequence. Jab, cross, low kick, calibrated to overwhelm someone unused to managing that level of speed and variety simultaneously. Nolan moved back half a step, rotated at the shoulder, and let the sequence resolve without him being in the center of it. The crowd assumed luck. Ryder reset and came again with more commitment, a higher volume of strikes designed to crowd Nolan into the ropes and end the sequence with a takedown. Nolan was not there when each strike arrived. He kept his hands open, his elbows in, and his feet in a configuration that looked passive to everyone watching, but was in fact a very specific language, spoken only by people who had learned to fight in environments where fighting badly had consequences that lasted longer than the moment. After the first minute, the laughter in the arena thinned out and was replaced by something more complicated. Ryder was accurate and powerful and fast, and he was not landing anything cleanly. Grant watched from his seat at the ringside table and made a gesture at Ryder that meant increase pressure, and Ryder responded by driving forward and pressing Nolan into the corner ropes with his body weight. He leaned in close enough to speak and said that it did not matter how the next 2 minutes went, because the land would transfer to Red Harbor's account before noon the following day, and the only question was whether Nolan wanted to go home with broken ribs or just with a bruised ego. Nolan registered that Ryder had been told the auction timeline, which meant Ryder was not simply a hired entertainer. He was a participant who understood the purpose of the evening. Nolan said, quietly enough that only the small directional microphone attached to the near ring post could have captured it. You came in here to prove you're stronger than someone who can't fight back. But the person who's afraid right now isn't me. Ryder pulled back and swung wide with his right elbow in a move that fell outside the parameters both referees had signed. Nolan ducked it. He did not counter. Everett Shaw leaned forward in his chair. He had been watching the mechanics of Nolan's defense, the corner sweep, the distance management, the specific way he kept his body angled to protect not just himself but the secondary space around him, as if by reflex, and he recognized what he was looking at with the certainty of someone who had spent decades watching men trained in that specific way move under pressure. He looked at Nolan's left wrist and saw the faded lines of a tattoo that he knew. On the screens around the arena, and on every device receiving Mara Quinn's first publication, a financial document appeared showing a wire transfer between an entity registered to Grant Holloway's operational division at Carrington Holdings and the primary account used by Red Harbor Logistics. Grant received a notification on his phone and immediately looked at the broadcast engineers across the hall and drew a finger across his throat. Celeste, who had been given control of the broadcast system by the venue's technical director 20 minutes earlier, locked Grant's override credentials from the CEO terminal on her tablet. The stream continued. Ryder, whose own phone had begun to vibrate with messages from his management team, understood in the space of approximately 4 seconds that the structure he had been operating within was dissolving. He decided that if he was going to face consequences, he would at least end the match on his own terms. He loaded his weight into his back hip and launched a turning kick at full force, aimed at Nolan's midsection. Nolan had been watching Ryder drop his right hand after every rotation for 3 minutes. He stepped inside the arc of the kick, redirected the momentum with both forearms, controlled Ryder's plant leg at the knee, and guided him to the mat in a movement that lasted less than 2 seconds and covered less than 4 feet of space. The technique was so clean and so complete that the crowd's reaction arrived approximately 3 seconds after the movement ended, because it took that long for most of them to process what had happened. Nolan took Ryder's arm in a standard joint control position and held it with the minimum necessary force. Ryder tried to break the position twice. Both attempts resolved exactly the way Nolan had set them up to resolve. Nolan had the leverage to cause serious injury and made no move toward it, reducing his grip pressure incrementally in a way that communicated clearly and without words that continuing was Ryder's choice and that Nolan's restraint was not a failure of capability. Everett Shaw rose from his seat. Lieutenant Commander Nolan Vance. The convention center went entirely quiet. Everett stood at the rail of the reserved section with the posture of a man who had given orders in rooms where the orders mattered, and he said in a voice that did not need amplification that the man currently controlling the ring had served as the commanding officer of a Navy SEAL unit, that he had personally overseen an extraction operation in which Nolan had brought 17 civilians and the majority of his team out of a compromised situation under active fire, and that his service record's brevity was not evidence of fabrication, but of classification. Nolan, still holding Ryder's arm on the mat, said without looking up that Everett should stop there, because every man in that unit had done things worth acknowledging, and he was not the only one who deserved to have his name spoken in a room full of people. The referee asked Ryder if he was submitting. Ryder tapped the mat. Nolan released the hold immediately and offered his hand. Ryder took it and let himself be helped to his feet with the expression of a man who has just had something very specific and very important removed from him. Not his pride exactly, but his ability to use pride as a substitute for self-knowledge. Grant demanded that the result be nullified on grounds that Nolan had concealed relevant combat experience. Celeste opened the contract on the screen of her tablet, read the relevant clause aloud, and confirmed that military service did not constitute a professional competitive record under the agreed definition. The escrow account released $250,000. Grant attempted to move toward the exit, and Ryder reached the microphone before anyone else could speak. He said, loudly, and with the clarity of someone who has finally decided that the cost of a lie is higher than the cost of the truth, that Grant Holloway had told him personally that Nolan Vance would never see the prize money, and that the foreclosure on the farm was scheduled for the following morning, and that he had taken money from Grant's connected accounts to ensure the performance went the way it was supposed to go. He said he did not know Grant was stealing from veterans. He said he was not sure how much that distinction was worth, but he wanted it on record. Grant turned toward the crowd and began constructing an alternative narrative, something about loyalty to the foundation and the danger of accepting accusations from a performer trying to protect his own image. Nolan stepped between Grant and the section of the audience that had begun moving toward him. He said that accountability and retaliation were not the same thing, and that what happened next needed to happen through the correct processes and not through the feeling of the moment. Grant stared at Nolan and could not find a response to being protected by the person he had tried to destroy. Law enforcement personnel whom Celeste had contacted earlier in the day entered through the rear entrance of the convention hall and accepted Grant's documentation from her team. The auction order on Willow Bend was suspended pending fraud investigation. The escrow funds were confirmed as legally transferable. Mara Quinn published the second document package, Grant's electronic signature on 4 separate loan transfer authorizations made using Red Harbor's account structure. Celeste walked to the center of the hall and offered Nolan an expanded foundation grant to develop Willow Bend into a regional training and employment center for veterans, contingent on a governance structure he could approve. He said he would accept it on the condition that the fund operated under an independent oversight board with public financial reporting and veteran representation at the decision-making level, which meant that the Carrington family would retain symbolic association with the program but would not control its allocation. Celeste agreed to this without hesitation, in public, in front of the people whose charitable contributions had been routed through a structure designed to serve someone else's interests. It cost her a kind of control she had inherited rather than chosen, and she gave it up more easily than she had expected. Ryder found Nolan near the exit while the hall was still sorting itself into smaller conversations and asked him to keep certain details out of the public record in order to preserve some portion of his professional standing. Nolan told him he would not cover for him and would not pursue him, that what Ryder chose to do with the facts of the evening was his own decision, and that the difference between a real fighter and a fabricated one was not physical ability, but what a person did when the audience stopped watching. He said it without cruelty and without satisfaction. Ryder stood there for a moment and then walked back into the center of the room to give a statement to the press. Nolan stepped outside and called Avery. She had watched the entire broadcast from her dormitory. She did not lead with congratulations. She said she was not proud because he had beaten a black belt. She was proud because he could have hurt Ryder and had chosen not to, and because that choice was the most honest thing she had ever seen him put on display. Nolan stood in the parking area beside his truck and did not say anything for several seconds, which was itself a kind of communication between people who have known each other long enough to understand the vocabulary of silences. He told her he was sorry he had kept the farm situation from her. He told her he was sorry he had kept most of it from her for most of her life. Avery said she already understood why he had done it, and that she did not need him to have been less of what he was in order to have been a good father. She told him to drive carefully. He told her he would. The media were waiting near the entrance, and he walked past them toward the truck, and one of them called after him to ask if he had anything to say about what had happened. He said he was going to drive home and fix a pump that had been giving him trouble for the past month, and he got into the truck and drove. The investigation into Grant Holloway's activities took 4 months and resulted in criminal charges for financial fraud, misappropriation of charitable funds, and contract manipulation. Several properties in the corridor had been acquired under similar accelerated foreclosure conditions, and their owners received notifications that the transactions were under review. Ryder Kane lost his primary sponsorships within 3 weeks of the gala. He issued a formal apology. Not a carefully worded statement from a publicist, but a specific account of what he had agreed to do and why, and dedicated a period of time to working with organizations that assisted veterans in transition, doing it without cameras present. Celeste restructured the Carrington Foundation under the governance parameters Nolan had specified, which became a model cited by 2 other family foundations in their own restructuring conversations. The relationship between Celeste and Nolan developed at the pace of people who have earned their caution through experience, and it expressed itself most often in the form of work. She attended oversight board meetings at Willow Bend, and he attended Carrington board sessions when Veterans Affairs were on the agenda. and the distance between them narrowed at a rate that neither of them announced or calculated. Everett Shaw invited Nolan to a formal ceremony recognizing the operational record of his unit, and Nolan did not refuse the way he had refused similar invitations in previous years. He asked that it be scheduled on a day when Avery could come home from school. 6 months after the gala, Willow Bend opened the first phase of what became a vocational and agricultural training center, operating under an independent land trust that prevented any commercial acquisition of the property. Celeste arrived with the deed documents. Avery drove back from the university for the occasion. Everett appeared in civilian clothes and shook hands with each of the veterans working on the property without ceremony or documentation. Ryder sent a package by mail, the box of tissues he had held up at the weigh-in, accompanied by a handwritten letter that ran to 3 pages. Nolan read the letter and filed it with the other gala materials in a folder he kept in the records room. He did not put it on a shelf. A young veteran named Marcus, who had arrived at Willow Bend 2 months earlier, asked Nolan one morning how it was possible to control someone with Ryder Kane's ability while barely throwing a punch. Nolan picked up a fence post and set it in the ground before he answered. He said that Ryder had walked into that ring to prove he was stronger than another man, which meant the outcome he was fighting for was about the other man. He had walked in to protect something that could not walk out without him, which meant the outcome he was fighting for was never about Ryder at all. He said the difference between those two things was not a technique. Then he went back to the fence, and the morning continued the way mornings on Willow Bend always continued, with work that required attention and offered something more durable than applause. The sign at the entrance to the property still read Willow Bend Farm in faded black letters, the same sign it had carried for years, and beneath the name, in smaller text added recently, a single line. Strength is what remains when pride steps aside. The man who had been laughed at in a convention center 6 months ago was exactly where he had been before all of it, doing the same work, wearing the same boots, giving the same attention to things that most people would not consider worth protecting. He had not won because he was a Navy SEAL. He had won because after everything that title had required him to carry, the losses, the silences, the years of being the person no one knew, he had remained someone strong enough not to let any of that become cruelty.